in the whole daycare situation. And I guess the first thing I would say is that I don't think that the federal government should be spending a penny on daycare. I'm not entirely sure that any government should be spending any money on daycare, but municipal governments and federal and provincial governments, are already in that area. To turn around and say that now the federal government is going to come in and implement some sort of a national daycare program is to add on unnecessarily another layer of bureaucracy. And again, it is offensive to those of us who understand that there may be 3 or 4 levels of government in this country, in some jurisdictions, but there's only one level of taxpayer. So it shouldn't matter to anybody whether it's money that's being taken out of our pockets by provincial governments and being handed out to parents who want to work and put their children in daycare. That's their choice. But I have a real question as to whether or not philosophically that's an appropriate thing to do, is to force the rest of us to pay for that, number one. But number two, whether we're paying for it through provincial taxes or federal taxes, it's still us that are paying for it, still we who are paying for it. So I found that to be a little troubling. And the final point, before you jump in there, Nick, if you on your comments on that, is this $15 an hour federal minimum wage. Now, when I heard it first proposed, I'm sure that I heard them talking about federal minimum wage in federally regulated industries. And I thought, okay, well, probably in federal regulated industries, people are already making more than $15 an hour anyway because of the nature of those institutions, right? But I did note that in the annex documents to the budget, there was no mention of federally regulated institutions. It was just a $15 an hour federally mandated minimum wage. So people out there, our listeners who are in Canada, because not all of our audience are Canadian, should be paying attention to that as well, to make sure that the federal government is not going to foist on the country a federal mandate of $15 an hour, a minimum wage. And one last comment, something else for us to look for, Nick, and to be aware of, is that the government is going to be initiating consultations on what it calls a corporate governance diversity. In this one does say in federally regulated institutions. And what that means is that they want to look at ways for boards of directors in those sectors to be diversity, to meet diversity standards, which could mean gender balance. It could mean gender identity balance, okay, which opens up a whole can of worms. For instance, what happens if I have an all-man board of directors? So let's say I have 5 men who are directors of a company, and 2 of those men decide that they want to transition and become quote-unquote women. Do I now meet the gender equality or gender diversity standards? Probably I would. Anyway.
That's, I would, you know what? In this twisted world, I would not find that hard to believe at all.
So anyway.
Because people are incredibly, go ahead.
I was going to say why that would be in the budget, I don't know. But there it was, buried away in the annex documents. And anyway, I just wanted to say that to bring that out to people's attention. So I'm going to shut up now, Nick, and let you talk a little bit.
Well, okay. Let's set that folly aside, because in today's world, nothing surprises me anymore. Not when it comes to that kind of nonsense, because that's exactly what it is. It's utter. I even lack the words to describe the folly of these kinds of ideas. So the one thing that I will say about this is, first of all, I don't believe in a minimum wage. Certainly not the way that it's laid out in Canada right now, where some level of government tells the private sector how much a job is worth, and it then insists you have to pay it, even if the wealth created by the job does not support that income level. I mean, how many? I've said this before too. How many cups of coffee do you have to pour working at your local coffee shop to justify $15 an hour? That's a lot of coffee. Even at today's inflated rates, that's a lot of coffee. So how do you decide what a job is worth? And what kind of lunatic would ever say the government's the best source or the best place to decide that? They cannot run a one-legged race to a two-legged, a one-man race to a two-man outhouse. And we're going to trust them to tell us how much a job is worth? I'm sorry, I just have a real problem with that. So from that perspective, the government has no business telling people who create wealth how to go about doing it when they don't do anything but consume wealth. That's what governments do by their nature. It's called taxes. And I don't have a problem with paying taxes as long as that money goes to things that, and I hate the sound of this, but go to serve the common good. I mean, if you have a highway that needs to be built, or if you have to negotiate a trade arrangement with another country, most of us cannot, the vast majority of us cannot do that for ourselves. That's a national issue, and it's the proper role of government to do that. But to decide how much the private sector has to pay somebody, I'm sorry, that to me makes no sense at all. So when you think about this, if you actually sit down and go, okay, what's the long-term consequences? And it's the same old saw. You put people out of work when you do this kind of stuff because mom and pop, the most corporation, because everybody's thinking about, the Walmarts and the Costcos and the different major corporations that litter the landscape on Wall Street and on Bloor Street. They're the ones that employ people, when in fact only 20% of people actually work for those. Most of them, the other 80%, all work for small, $1 to $2 million corporations, just mom and pop outfits and so on, whether it be a nursery or a corner store or whatever it is. And they don't have the kind of resources necessary to reach into the envelope of what money they have that they've budgeted for salaries and simply just hand over another $40 a week per person who's on their staff. It might not sound like much, but that can be the difference between success and failure. Since they don't want to go out of business and they still have to come up with the money, somebody has to be laid off. And it's usually the lowest person on the list, the one who desperately needs the job the most.
Well, and how do you, let's say you're in, even in a big city like Toronto, and you're running a small corner store, and somebody in first year university or maybe a senior in high school comes to you and says, hey, I could use the money. I'll work for you for minimum wage, stocking shelves and sweeping the floor, etc. And, if I'm going to school 20 hours a week, I can afford to spend 30, 35, 36 hours a week doing this work for you. But if I have to pay that person $15 an hour, even in a big city like Toronto, I'm certainly not going to do it. If I'm the owner of that corner store, and I can afford to pay the person, let's say $9, $10 an hour, because I can't make that money magically appear. I have to have that revenue. And the revenue is not tied to how much I'm paying my workers. So, if I don't have the revenue, I can't afford to pay it. And if I can't afford to pay it, I'm not going to hire him. I'm just going to work the extra hours myself as the owner, and keep the money in my own pocket. So it's not just that people are losing jobs, it's the jobs that you're not creating as well. And I think that that's an important thing. And with that, we're going to have to leave it, Nick. I see we're at the bottom of the hour here already. So, time flew by. And, of course, we started just a teensy bit late, but we're back on track now. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you're listening to the live broadcast, stay put. We'll be back in a few minutes. If you're listening to the podcast, thank you very much for joining in, and we will catch you tomorrow morning for part 2 of this week's Nick and Joe Show on ThinkRadio.ca.